She arrived at the concert hall carrying a small bag over her shoulder and a quiet determination in her eyes. The hall was enormous, more than she had ever seen in person, with rows upon rows of seats climbing up to the high ceiling. Crystal chandeliers hung from above, catching the light and scattering it across the polished wood floor. There was a subtle hum in the air, the mixture of excitement, chatter, and anticipation that always seemed to fill these places before a performance. She had been invited not as a headline performer but simply as someone who wanted to play. It was a small request, almost an afterthought in the program, and yet she had carried it in her heart for weeks, planning the moment she would sit down at the grand piano in the corner. Walking through the entrance, she felt the eyes of the staff and a few early arrivals glance at her. She noticed the well-dressed guests with their sharp suits and elegant dresses, each carrying the expectation that tonight would be filled with mastery and grandeur. She felt out of place for a moment, clutching her bag as if it were a shield. But then she reminded herself why she was here. She wasn't seeking fame or applause. She wanted only to share a simple melody, something pure and unpretentious, a tune that came from the heart. The pianist who had been scheduled for the main performance was already seated backstage, tuning the massive grand piano that dominated the center of the stage. Her plan was simple: to ask for permission to play a small piece on the smaller piano set off to the side. It wasn't impressive by most standards. It had scratches on the surface, the pedals were worn, and the keys had a faint yellow tint that spoke of years of use. But it was hers, for that moment, if only she could convince someone to let her play. Approaching the stage manager, she spoke softly. "May I play a simple piece before the main performance? Just a few minutes." She tried to keep her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. The man looked down at her, his expression caught between curiosity and irritation. He was a large man with a serious demeanor, and she could sense that he was used to dealing with requests that seemed inconvenient. He tapped his clipboard lightly and asked, "A simple piece? Here? Now? The hall is almost full, and the main performance starts soon. Are you sure?" She nodded, keeping her gaze steady. "Yes, it's very short and I only want a few minutes. It won't interfere." Her voice had a calmness that seemed to surprise him. He studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "Fine, you have 5 minutes. Don't delay the schedule." Grateful, she followed him to the side piano. The hall had begun to fill rapidly, and the buzz of conversation and movement around her was almost dizzying. She tried to focus, inhaling deeply, letting the excitement and nervousness mingle inside her. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling the worn wood beneath her fingers. It was not the smooth, glossy surface of a new grand piano, but it had a character of its own. Each key had a story, each note a memory of someone else who had sat here and made music that once echoed through the room. She took a moment to close her eyes, listening to the faint echo of her own breathing in the large hall. A few latecomers walked past, casting curious glances her way. She imagined what they might be thinking. Probably that this was not the moment for a quiet, simple tune. They expected brilliance, spectacle, and technical perfection. And perhaps she had no right to expect them to care about a small melody from an unknown musician. But she also knew that music was not always about grandeur. Sometimes the simplest notes could carry the deepest feelings. When she opened her eyes, she saw the audience beginning to settle. The chatter dimmed slightly as more people took their seats, unaware that something different was about to happen in the corner. Some whispered to each other, noticing her but not paying much attention. She noticed a few skeptical faces, people whose brows were furrowed as they tried to understand why anyone would want to play here at this moment, before the headline performance. But she refused to let doubt shake her resolve. She lifted her fingers to the keys, feeling their coolness, and let her mind quiet down. The first note sounded tentative, almost fragile, and it drew a few curious glances from nearby seats. It was not loud, not showy, but it carried a subtle clarity that seemed to cut through the ambient noise of the hall. She played slowly, deliberately, each note falling into place, as though it were a stepping stone across a quiet river. There was a hush as people began to notice the music, though some still whispered, confused by the smallness of the sound. It wasn't demanding attention. It wasn't flashy. It simply existed, a small ripple in the vast space of the room. Her heart beat faster as she continued, fingers moving in a careful rhythm, never rushing, never pausing too long. She imagined the faces of those who might feel a memory stirred by the notes, a warmth creeping into the edges of their thoughts. And indeed, she saw subtle shifts. A man in the third row leaned forward slightly, as if listening more closely. A woman on the balcony raised her eyebrows in surprise, hearing something in the music that made her stop speaking. Even some of the skeptical ones seemed to pause, sensing that this was more than a trivial sound. But many still whispered, unconvinced, expecting the real performance to begin. She was aware of every subtle reaction in the room. Each glance, each twitch of the mouth, each foot tapping against the floor was like a small ripple on the surface of the water she had just disturbed. She played not for applause but to let the music exist in the space, to see what it might awaken in others. The piece she had chosen was simple, a melody she had written herself, inspired by quiet afternoons in the park, the sound of rain against windows, the way light moves across a table in the early morning. It was personal, yet she hoped it might resonate beyond herself. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours to her, and she was acutely aware of the audience's mixed reactions. Some faces were relaxed now, showing signs of enjoyment. Others remained skeptical, still whispering to neighbors, clearly waiting for the main event. But she continued undeterred. Each note was deliberate, each chord carefully chosen, and her focus deepened. She felt herself slipping into the music entirely, no longer thinking about the audience, the hall, or the schedule. Only the piano and the melody mattered. Only the gentle pull of sound across the empty spaces in people's hearts mattered. She noticed a few children in the audience looking around, curious about the small figure playing so earnestly. One little boy leaned over to his mother, whispering a question about who she was. She imagined them feeling the notes in their own way, not yet understanding the depth, but sensing the sincerity. That thought brought a quiet smile to her lips, and she allowed herself a moment of pleasure, knowing that music could reach even the youngest hearts without explanation or pretense. A few latecomers continued to enter, glancing at her with a mix of confusion and amusement. Some whispered to their companions, probably wondering why the staff allowed someone to play a minor piece before the main performance. She ignored the judgments. This moment was hers, and if even one person listened fully, it would be enough. By now, the room's attention was slowly shifting. The fragile, simple tune had begun to weave its way into the consciousness of the audience. The initial skepticism faded just a little, replaced by curiosity and tentative appreciation. She could feel the subtle energy in the room, a quiet acknowledgement of presence. She was no longer invisible. Her small request had created a space where music and human emotion could meet. As the piece reached its quiet conclusion, she allowed the final note to linger in the air, not sharp or commanding, but soft and delicate. It hung in the hall for a moment, almost invisible, like a whisper that had traveled far. She lifted her hands from the keys slowly, feeling the coolness fade and the echoes of her playing settle into the silence. For a heartbeat, there was stillness. Then, a few hesitant claps broke out from the front rows. They were cautious, unsure if they should applaud, but they could not deny the gentle power of what they had just heard. More hands joined, gradually growing louder as the audience began to understand the quiet magic of the simple melody. She stood quietly, nodding, acknowledging the subtle applause, but not basking in it. Her joy was private, rooted in the act of playing itself, the gift she had offered without expectation. In that moment, she realized something important. Even a small request, a simple melody, could ripple through the hearts of people who were not ready, who did not expect it, and still leave an impression. It was not about grandeur, fame, or perfection. It was about honesty, connection, and courage. And though the crowd had not been ready for her, they had begun to notice, to feel, to open a space in themselves for something they had not anticipated. She gathered her bag, thanked the staff, and stepped back from the piano, allowing the main performance to begin. As she moved to the side, She felt lighter, freer, and quietly proud. She had asked for a simple thing, and even in its simplicity it had mattered. The experience had reminded her that music, when given honestly, could bridge the gap between expectation and reality, between skepticism and wonder. And as the next notes filled the hall from the grand stage, she carried with her the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had left a small, unforgettable mark on the hearts of those who had listened. She returned to the piano the next day with a quiet excitement that made her chest feel light. The memory of the previous performance lingered in her mind, and though it had been brief, it had left a deep impression on her. Today was different. She was allowed more time, a chance to explore the music in a way that would not be rushed or interrupted. The hall was familiar now, the polished wood gleaming under the chandeliers, the seats arranged in perfect rows. A few staff members greeted her warmly, remembering her small request from the day before. Some of the audience had already returned, curious to hear her again, though most were unaware of her presence. She walked to the piano with a calm, steady pace. Her fingers hovered over the keys, remembering the feel of each one. She noticed the imperfections, the slight unevenness, and the worn edges that had once seemed a challenge. Now they felt like an old friend, familiar and full of character. She had spent hours at home, practicing, imagining how to reach the hearts of those who had doubted her the first time. But practice alone was not enough. It was about presence, about connecting with the space, the piano, and the unseen ears waiting to listen. Taking a deep breath, she began with a simple melody, one she knew could carry warmth without needing grandeur. The sound was soft at first, gentle and hesitant, like the morning sun peeking through clouds. A few audience members turned their heads, intrigued by the unassuming start. The piece was simple, not demanding attention, but it had a subtle weight to it. Each note seemed to float in the hall, lingering just long enough for someone to notice. The effect was slow but powerful. The audience could not ignore it for long. She let herself become fully absorbed in the music. She did not think about judgment, about expectation, or about whether the crowd would understand. Each chord was deliberate, each pause measured, yet fluid. She imagined the faces of people listening, the stories they carried, and how a simple melody could touch them in ways that words could not. The hall seemed to breathe with her playing, each note echoing gently against the high ceiling, resonating through the wooden floor. As she continued, subtle changes began to emerge in the audience. A few people leaned forward, curious, their frowns softening into attentive expressions. She could see the quiet shifting, the walls of skepticism melting slowly as people allowed themselves to listen without expectation. A man in the third row tapped his foot gently, almost unconsciously, as if responding to a rhythm that reached inside him. A woman on the balcony crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing at first, then widening slightly, sensing the sincerity of the music. It was not flashy, it was not bold, but it was real, and that made it compelling. The piano, imperfect and worn, seemed to come alive under her hands. Each key offered a small challenge, a unique resistance that she learned to work with, not against. She had discovered a new level of intimacy with the instrument. It responded to her touch not as a machine, but as a partner in conversation. The melody she played was modest, a small gift to the audience, yet it had a presence that made the space itself feel different. She realized that music, at its heart, was about sharing a piece of oneself, a small truth that could resonate beyond the immediate moment. A few moments of silence punctuated the piece, allowing the sound to hang in the air. She noticed subtle gestures from the audience. Someone tilting their head, someone closing their eyes, another sitting straighter as if to pay attention more fully. These small acknowledgments gave her confidence. She felt a quiet joy in seeing that music, even in its simplicity, could reach people in ways she had hoped but not fully expected. It was not about applause or recognition. It was about touching something unseen, a part of the human experience that often went unnoticed. She introduced gentle variations in the melody, soft shifts in rhythm and tone that gave the piece a quiet complexity. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but it began to draw the listeners deeper. Some faces relaxed, Some lips curved into small smiles, and a few people looked around, perhaps noticing that others were also responding. The hall had changed. It was no longer just a space of expectation and chatter. It was a place where music had started to weave its own narrative, a quiet story told without words. She paused briefly, letting her fingers rest on the keys, feeling the vibrations settle. In that moment, she sensed a collective awareness among the listeners. They were no longer just watching or waiting. They were participating, in a silent, invisible way. Her music had become a bridge, connecting the unseen emotions of the audience to the simple act of sound. She felt gratitude for the opportunity to play, for the piano that allowed her expression, and for the people who, though not ready at first, had begun to open themselves to the experience. The melody shifted again, slightly more confident now, yet still tender. She explored the dynamics gently, letting louder notes rise naturally and fading them into softness. The audience followed, some leaning forward, some closing their eyes, fully absorbed. She noticed a few people shifting in their seats, moved by the subtle power of the music. Their responses were quiet, almost imperceptible, but they mattered. She played for them, for their hidden reactions, knowing that the smallest gestures could mean the world to someone. Time seemed to stretch. The piece she played was not long, but she took care to let each moment unfold fully. She did not rush. She let the music breathe. The audience, too, seemed to adjust, no longer glancing at their watches or whispering. The hall was still and alive at the same time, a paradox that she had learned to navigate through sound. Each note was an invitation, each chord a gentle nudge toward emotion, reflection, and connection. She imagined the lives of the listeners outside the hall, their worries, their joys, their routines, and how this simple moment might reach them in ways they did not anticipate. Music, she realized, was a gift precisely because it could cross boundaries, touch memories, and evoke feelings without demanding explanation. She played with awareness of this power, letting it guide her fingers and her heart. A subtle shift in the audience's energy became evident. Conversations stopped, movements slowed, and even the air seemed to hold its breath. The music had found a way to connect people who did not know each other, in a space that had once been indifferent to her presence. She felt a quiet satisfaction in this realization. It was proof that honesty and sincerity could make even the smallest act significant. She was not performing to impress. She was offering something genuine, and that authenticity had begun to ripple through the hall. As the piece approached its final section, she allowed the melody to rise slightly, still gentle, yet imbued with warmth and emotion. She played each note with intention, aware that the smallest detail mattered. A few listeners shifted in their seats, some leaning forward as if to catch every sound more clearly. She noticed subtle smiles appearing, the occasional catch of a breath, the gentle nods that marked appreciation. The music had begun to touch them, in ways that were quiet, personal, and profound. The final chord lingered in the hall, held just long enough for silence to embrace it. She allowed her hands to rest lightly on the keys, feeling the vibration fade and the echoes settle. For a moment, the hall was still, except for the faint rustle of shifting feet and quiet sighs. Then, slowly, tentative applause began to rise. One hand clapped, then another, until the gentle sound swelled. It was not the loud ovation of a headline performance, but it was meaningful. It was acknowledgement, understanding, and respect, born from the quiet power of simple music. She stood and nodded gently to the audience, feeling a sense of connection that went beyond words. She had asked for a small opportunity, a simple request, and in giving it her full attention and sincerity, she had created something that mattered. The audience, once unaware or indifferent, had begun to listen, to feel, and to respond. It was not about grandeur, showmanship, or expectation. It was about presence, honesty, and the subtle impact that one person could make through music. Packing her bag, she felt a quiet elation. The hall would soon be filled with the next performance, and she would step aside once more, leaving space for others. Yet the feeling in her heart was profound. She had learned that even a simple request, met with uncertainty at first, could become a meaningful experience if approached with care, patience, and authenticity. The piano had become her voice, the hall a canvas, and the audience collaborators in a shared, invisible journey. It was a reminder that small gestures, done sincerely, could leave lasting impressions, touching people in ways that were gentle, unexpected, and deeply human. She sat at the piano again, feeling the familiar texture of the keys beneath her fingers. Today was different. The hall was quieter, as though it sensed what was about to happen. A few early arrivals whispered among themselves, curious to see her again, the unknown pianist who had captured attention with a small, simple melody. She took a deep breath, letting the sound of silence fill her mind before touching the keys. This time, she intended to explore the depth of the music, not just the notes themselves, but the emotions they could carry. Her fingers began to move with gentle confidence, drawing out a melody that was soft yet deliberate. It was not loud or grandiose, but it had a richness that seemed to fill the space naturally. The first few notes traveled across the hall, quiet but full of intent. She noticed a few people leaning forward, tilting their heads as if listening more carefully. Some faces, skeptical at first, now reflected curiosity. She felt a subtle thrill at knowing that this small act, this simple music, could draw attention without demanding it. As she continued, the melody began to shift, introducing subtle variations in rhythm and tone. Each chord was deliberate, each pause meaningful. She played with awareness, feeling the resonance of each note in the hall, letting the sound linger just long enough to settle into the audience's consciousness. She could see how even small changes affected the room. A slight variation in tempo made someone in the third row catch their breath, while a soft lift in melody caused another listener to close their eyes, absorbed. It was proof that music, in its simplest form, could evoke profound reactions. She let herself become fully immersed in the music. She was no longer conscious of the audience, the hall, or the expectations. Only the piano and the melody mattered. She imagined the feelings each note might stir, small emotions tucked away in people's hearts, waiting to be awakened. She had learned that her role was not to impress but to connect, to create a space where emotion could move freely, and she played with this purpose in mind. The hall was slowly changing. Where there had been whispers and mild curiosity, there was now focused attention. People who had been frowning, impatient, or doubtful were now leaning forward slightly, their eyes attentive. She noticed small gestures, a hand resting lightly on a knee, a foot tapping in time, a head nodding almost imperceptibly. These subtle signs reassured her. The music was being heard not just with ears, but with the heart. Her melody deepened, carrying a mix of emotions, gentle sadness, quiet hope, and a sense of nostalgia. She explored dynamic shifts, letting soft notes rise slightly and fade again, creating a conversation between silence and sound. The worn piano keys responded to her touch, imperfect yet full of character, each producing a tone with unique warmth. She had learned to play with these nuances, letting the imperfections add personality rather than hide her expression. It was as if the piano itself had become a partner in her storytelling. A few audience members shifted in their seats, clearly moved by the music. Some wiped subtle tears, others smiled softly, memories stirred by the melody. She did not play for applause, yet the reactions gave her quiet satisfaction. The music was not hers alone anymore. It belonged to the room, to everyone present, even if they did not yet realize it. The melody had become a shared experience, invisible yet tangible, connecting strangers through sound and feeling. She allowed the tune to grow slightly, building a delicate tension that was not dramatic but emotionally compelling. It was the kind of music that made people reflect, that invited them to pause and consider something beyond the immediate. A man in the balcony rested his chin on his hand, lost in thought, while a woman in the front row closed her eyes, letting the music evoke memories she had not thought of in years. The effect was subtle, yet undeniable. Even those who had entered the hall skeptical of her presence were now caught in the quiet spell of her playing. Every so often, she would pause, letting the silence stretch for a moment, allowing the last note to resonate in the air. The silence was not empty. It carried the weight of what had been expressed, giving the audience space to feel, to absorb, to reflect. Then she would continue, weaving in new chords, shifting rhythms ever so slightly, adding color and texture to the simple melody. The variations were not showy but intentional, revealing depth without losing the piece's gentle simplicity. She noticed small, unexpected interactions. Two audience members who had seemed indifferent were now exchanging glances, as if silently acknowledging the impact of the music. A child near the front leaned against a parent, listening intently, wide-eyed and curious. The subtle influence of the melody was spreading, touching each listener differently but undeniably. She realized that her music was not meant to be universal in the obvious sense but personal in its reach. Each person experienced it uniquely, yet everyone was connected by its presence. Her confidence grew as she played. She was no longer worried about being noticed or judged. Each note was a statement, not of skill or bravado, but of intention and emotion. She had come to understand that music could bypass intellect, reaching directly to the feelings people carried silently inside them. The hall, which had once felt intimidating and impersonal, now felt alive, responsive, and intimate. She could feel the collective attention settling around her, a gentle energy that neither pressured nor distracted, but simply existed alongside her music. The melody began to reach its emotional peak. It was not loud, nor was it complex, but there was a clarity and depth that could not be denied. Listeners leaned forward, silent tears glimmered in a few eyes, and a soft smile spread across others. The music seemed to tell stories without words, stories of longing, of quiet courage, of moments often overlooked in the rush of life. Each chord, each gentle transition, added meaning without force, coaxing the audience to feel rather than analyze. She allowed herself a brief pause, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. The resonance of the notes continued to vibrate through the hall, a subtle echo that reached every corner. She looked up, noticing the audience fully attentive now, some motionless, some leaning closer, all absorbing the unassuming power of her playing. Even the skeptics were beginning to respond, perhaps unconsciously, as the music slowly carved a path into their hearts. It was not the applause they had expected, not a grand gesture, but an understanding that something delicate and true had occurred. Gradually, she guided the melody to a gentle conclusion. The final notes hung in the air, fragile yet lasting, like a soft breath that refused to vanish quickly. She let the sound dissolve naturally, leaving silence that felt charged with presence and emotion. The hall remained still for a heartbeat, each listener processing in their own way the effect of what they had just heard. The experience was intimate, personal, and powerful in its understated simplicity. Then, quietly, applause began to rise. It started small, tentative, as if people were unsure how to react, and then grew steadily, more confident and heartfelt. She stood and nodded lightly, feeling the warmth of recognition, yet not seeking it. The music had done its work, touching hearts without pretense or demand. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that a simple request had blossomed into a shared moment of connection. She had played not for fame or recognition, but to communicate, to give a piece of herself in sound. And in return, she had received the acknowledgement and quiet understanding that was more rewarding than any grand accolade. Packing her things, she reflected on the journey. She had come to the hall with a small request, uncertain of how it would be received. The simplicity of her music had initially been met with skepticism, yet persistence, sincerity, and careful attention to detail had begun to break down the barriers. The audience had shifted, responding to what was genuine rather than what was expected. Music, she realized, was a bridge, silent, invisible, and profound. It could carry emotion, heal quiet wounds, and foster understanding without a single word. She left the hall that day with a quiet joy, feeling lighter than when she had arrived. The experience had reinforced something she already believed, that small, sincere acts could have profound impact. Even a simple melody, played with intention and heart, could reach people in ways that were unexpected, subtle, and deeply human. The piano had not just been an instrument. It had been a vessel, and she had been its voice, conveying truth, emotion, and connection in the most unassuming yet powerful way possible. She approached the piano with a mixture of calmness and anticipation. The hall was dimly lit, but the chandeliers still caught faint glimmers of light, scattering them across the polished floor. A few early arrivals whispered quietly among themselves, curious about the pianist who had been quietly making her mark over the past few days. She felt no pressure, only a sense of purpose, knowing that today she would allow the music to unfold in its own time, and perhaps touch the hearts of those who had not expected to feel anything at all. Her fingers rested on the keys for a moment, feeling the familiar coolness and slight unevenness that had become comforting. The piano had its own character now, each key carrying a memory of previous performances, each note holding the resonance of emotion from those who had listened before. She let herself close her eyes briefly, inhaling the calm before the sound began. Then, softly, she pressed the first note, letting it echo through the hall. The melody was gentle, deliberate, and unassuming. At first, it seemed small, almost fragile, but it carried a weight that was invisible yet palpable. Some audience members shifted slightly, leaning forward as if trying to catch every note more clearly. Faces that had been skeptical before now held expressions of curiosity and quiet attention. The music was weaving its way into the consciousness of the listeners, inviting them to pause, reflect, and feel. She allowed the melody to grow slowly, adding subtle variations that changed the texture without disturbing its simplicity. Each chord was carefully chosen, each pause deliberate. She played with awareness, feeling the sound resonate not just in the hall but in herself. She could sense the audience responding, even those who remained quiet and reserved. The music had a way of drawing out emotions that words could not reach, and she felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that she was part of that process. As she continued, the atmosphere in the hall began to shift. Where there had been murmurs and impatient glances, there was now attentive stillness. Listeners were leaning forward, eyes focused on her hands, ears attuned to every subtle nuance. She noticed small, unconscious gestures. A foot tapping lightly, a hand resting on a knee, a head nodding almost imperceptibly. These signs told her that her music was being absorbed, felt, and appreciated. She let the melody carry a mixture of emotions: soft longing, quiet hope, and gentle nostalgia. It was not dramatic or forceful, but it moved through the hall like a whisper, touching each listener in its own way. Some faces reflected memories that had been tucked away for years. Others revealed a small smile, a moment of personal recognition or understanding. Even those who had been indifferent at first were now caught up in the quiet spell of the music. The piano responded to her touch with a subtle warmth. Each key had its own character, its own resistance, and she had learned to play with it, letting the imperfections add depth rather than hinder expression. She experimented with dynamics, letting the soft notes linger and the slightly louder ones rise naturally. The music became a conversation, not with words but with feeling, creating an invisible bond between herself and the listeners. A child in the front row watched with wide eyes, leaning against a parent, fascinated by the gentle movements of her hands. The music seemed to reach even the youngest hearts without explanation. She smiled softly, realizing that the simplicity of the melody allowed people of all ages to connect with it in their own way. The power of music lay not in complexity or showmanship, but in its ability to convey honesty and emotion. She allowed the melody to explore subtle shifts in rhythm, creating a sense of movement without breaking the tranquility. The hall seemed to breathe with her playing, the air vibrating gently with the sound. Listeners were drawn into the ebb and flow, following the subtle rise and fall of the notes. It was a quiet magic, a demonstration that simplicity could be profound, that a single person with a sincere expression could touch many hearts at once. Occasionally, she paused, letting the silence hold the echoes of the last chord. These pauses were intentional, giving the audience space to absorb the emotion, to reflect, to feel. The music had become a dialogue, silent but deeply felt, connecting the pianist and the listeners in a shared experience that transcended words. She realized that these moments of quiet were just as important as the notes themselves, allowing the emotional resonance to settle. She continued, introducing slight variations that added color and texture without disturbing the overall calm. The subtle changes drew attention, inviting listeners to notice details and to engage more deeply. The hall, once a space of expectation and movement, had become intimate and alive, each person present participating in the music in their own way. She felt the invisible energy of connection, a shared understanding that music could communicate without language. The melody reached a gentle climax, still soft, still tender, but imbued with a quiet intensity. The notes carried a sense of completion, of stories told without words, of emotions expressed without explanation. Audience members leaned forward, some closing their eyes, some taking a deep breath, all fully engaged in the experience. The music was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the hall, to the people listening, to the invisible threads of emotion that had been woven through each note. She guided the final notes with care, letting them linger just long enough to leave a sense of presence without overwhelming. The hall fell into a hush, each listener absorbing the conclusion in their own way. It was not a dramatic ending but a gentle settling, a soft landing after a journey of quiet emotional exploration. She felt a profound satisfaction, knowing that she had conveyed something meaningful through the simplicity of her expression. Then, slowly, applause began to rise. At first, it was tentative, soft, almost uncertain, but it grew steadily as listeners recognized the depth of what had been shared. It was not a loud, thunderous ovation, but it was genuine, heartfelt, and full of acknowledgement. She stood, bowing slightly, feeling the warmth of recognition and connection. The applause was not the goal, but it was a sign that the music had reached the hearts of those who had listened with openness and attention. As she packed her bag and stepped away from the piano, she reflected on the experience. The small, simple request to play had become a profound moment of connection. She had faced initial doubt and skepticism, yet through sincerity, patience, and care, she had created a space where music could touch the hearts of many. The audience had shifted, moved, and connected in ways that were quiet but powerful, demonstrating that honesty and emotion could transcend expectation. She left the hall that day with a sense of quiet triumph. The music had fulfilled its purpose, not in grandeur or spectacle, but in the subtle, invisible threads it wove between herself and the audience. She had learned once again that simplicity, sincerity, and courage could create moments that lingered long after the final note had faded. The piano had been more than an instrument. It had been a voice, a bridge, and a reminder that even the smallest gesture, done with heart, could resonate deeply and meaningfully with others. She entered the hall one last time, carrying a sense of quiet anticipation. Today felt different, as if the room itself was aware that something extraordinary might happen. The chandeliers reflected soft light across the polished floor, giving the space a gentle glow. The audience was settling in, some familiar faces from previous days, and some new visitors curious to see the pianist who had quietly touched so many hearts. She felt no rush, no pressure, only the desire to share the music that had been growing inside her for weeks. Sitting at the piano, she let her fingers hover over the keys, feeling their worn edges and familiar resistance. This instrument, imperfect in appearance and age, had become a trusted partner. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the memory of past performances guide her, feeling the hall's energy shift as if it knew she was ready. Then, softly, she pressed the first note, letting it echo gently. The sound was simple, humble, yet it carried a subtle strength that immediately filled the space. The melody was deliberate, tender, and layered with emotion. It was not a grand display, not a technical spectacle, but it had a sincerity that was impossible to ignore. She could see small reactions forming in the audience. Heads tilting, subtle smiles, a few people leaning forward. Even those who had once doubted her presence seemed drawn in, quietly observing each note, each pause, each gentle shift in rhythm. Her music was no longer just sound. It had become a bridge between herself and the listeners. She let the melody evolve naturally, introducing delicate variations in tempo and tone. Each chord was intentional, carrying emotion that needed no words. The hall seemed to breathe with her playing, the sound moving through the space, touching listeners in ways she could only imagine. She watched subtle gestures, a hand pressed to a chest, a foot tapping softly, a quiet intake of breath. These small signs of engagement filled her with quiet joy. She was not performing to impress but to connect, and the connection was happening. As the music deepened, the emotions became more apparent. Gentle sadness intertwined with hope, quiet nostalgia with a sense of peace. The piano responded to her touch with warmth, the keys giving a voice to her intentions. Imperfections in the instrument added texture rather than distraction, giving the music a humanity that made the audience lean in closer. It was not about skill or perfection, but about honesty, and the listeners were beginning to feel it. Some audience members closed their eyes, absorbing the sound fully. Others watched, noticing the subtle expressions on her face, the careful movements of her hands, and the invisible dialogue forming between performer and listener. Children and adults alike seemed captivated, each experiencing the music uniquely, yet collectively feeling its gentle pull. She had come to understand that music was personal and communal at the same time, able to speak directly to hearts while connecting everyone in the room. She paused briefly, letting the last note linger. Silence spread through the hall, not empty, but filled with the weight of what had been expressed. She sensed anticipation, a shared acknowledgement of the moment's significance. Then, without breaking the spell, she continued, introducing new patterns, soft lifts, and gentle falls in the melody. Each variation was subtle but deliberate, keeping the audience attentive and engaged without startling them. It was a quiet mastery of nuance, showing that simplicity could carry profound emotional weight. The hall had transformed into a space of collective listening. The energy shifted from curiosity to reflection, from skepticism to understanding. She noticed small details, a tear glinting in the corner of an eye, a slight nod, a hand gently pressing against a chest. These quiet reactions were more meaningful than applause. The music had created an invisible thread connecting everyone present, a shared experience that transcended words and expectations. She allowed the melody to swell gently, reaching an emotional peak without overpowering the subtlety of the piece. The notes spoke of longing, of courage, of moments too often overlooked in daily life. She guided the hall through a journey of feelings, each chord a step, each pause a place to reflect. The audience was fully immersed now, listening with a depth that went beyond hearing, responding with emotions that were personal yet shared. The piano and her hands moved in unison, as if telling a story together. She felt herself dissolving into the music, no longer a separate entity, but a vessel for the emotion that had been building inside. The audience, too, became part of this shared experience, their reactions subtle but palpable. She realized that the most profound moments often came from simplicity, from honesty, and from the courage to play something unadorned yet meaningful. A child near the front leaned forward, eyes wide with wonder, while an older audience member closed their eyes and breathed deeply, letting memories rise gently. She noticed a few people exchanging glances, silently acknowledging the emotional journey they were experiencing together. It was a quiet, intimate connection that went beyond applause, beyond recognition. It was something far deeper, a moment of shared humanity created through simple music. She guided the final notes with care, letting each chord resonate fully before fading naturally. The hall remained quiet for a heartbeat, the stillness filled with understanding, reflection, and emotion. Then, slowly, applause began to rise, tentative at first, and then stronger, more confident, as listeners expressed their appreciation. Some stood, some clapped softly, some simply smiled, all acknowledging the impact of the music in their own way. The recognition was meaningful, but she felt that the true reward had been in the act of playing itself, in the invisible connections made across the hall. Standing, she nodded to the audience, feeling a quiet satisfaction and humility. She had made a simple request, unsure of how it would be received, and yet it had blossomed into a profound experience for everyone present. The music had reached hearts that were not ready at first, opening them gently to emotion, reflection, and connection. It was a reminder that sincerity and courage, even in small gestures, could create lasting impressions. As she packed her bag, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The piano had become more than an instrument. It had been a voice, a bridge, and a companion. The music had shown that even the simplest expression could carry power and meaning. She had faced doubt, skepticism, and uncertainty, but persistence and honesty had turned a small request into an unforgettable experience. Leaving the hall, she felt a sense of lightness, of quiet triumph. The audience would remember this performance in ways both visible and invisible, carrying a piece of the experience with them. She understood that the impact of art was not always measured in grandeur or applause, but in the subtle ways it touched hearts and minds. Today had been a lesson in the profound potential of simplicity, and she carried that lesson forward with gratitude and humility. She had started with a simple piano request, and in doing so, she had achieved something far greater than she had imagined. The music had silenced doubt, softened skepticism, and connected strangers in a shared moment of humanity. It had shown that true artistry was not about spectacle, but about honesty, intention, and the courage to express oneself fully. And as she walked out of the hall, she knew that this small, quiet act would leave an echo, a lasting resonance, in the hearts of all who had listened.